everybody. Welcome to just a great milestone in the Baileywiki community is our first actual time getting together and talking about stuff. So rather than just hearing my voice, I've got some other members of the community that have been hard at work, kind of conceiving of this new thing, this new modular. You've seen me do modular towns and modular wilderness, but this concept of doing modular dungeons was just so daunting because of the sheer scope of it that I'd always sort of been wanting and hoping and planning for some of the more talented community members to come alongside and see if we could do something of that scale. And that's really what's been developing here over the last few weeks. Is we've now got that. So I wanted to just invite or just announce kind of who's been involved in this particular project, and there will, I'm sure, be more involved in the future. And what today's about is just talking through what is this modular dungeon project, and it was really built as a system that's essentially open source that anybody can build on top of to make it that much more useful to DMs over time. So we're going to walk through like what is this system about and why did we approach it this way, and then we're going to kind of hear from everybody who's had a hand in making this. So three main architects besides myself for this system are, and I'll go mostly by Discord names here. Rathji, who's not on this particular call, but you'll see some of his stuff here in a second. Zephyr, who's who's an admin on my Discord server, is really active in the community. You'll see some things from him like modular sewer and other stuff that he's introduced into the ecosystem. We'll talk to him about his approach. And then Ben also goes by Ako22. He's on the line as well, and he was one of the primary architects of the system itself. What we'll walk through today. And then Manaheim, who didn't build or contribute necessarily any tiles, but has been involved with sort of the development of the concept, super active in the community. She's also here. So between all of us, we're just going to kind of have an organic conversation and talk through, what is all this stuff, and then how can others potentially get involved with it. So I'll just ask the question, like, what's the goal of this? Why make a modular dungeon? And by the way, there's other modular dungeons out there, right? There's procedurally generated dungeons and other things, but why this project? Why is it interesting?
All right, I can start. To me, a big thing with the modular dungeon project and why I was so interested in it and really wanted to get this going is I do a lot of homebrew and custom building of my dungeons. And so having a much more granular system to place things, so I could be a lot more intentional with coming up with the story for it and the layouts and designs, which gives me just a bit more control than something that's procedurally generated. There's definitely a lot of value in procedural generation and randomized dungeons, but I wanted just a little bit more granularity there. And then also if I had a dungeon that I had developed in some other way, being able to drop it into individual pieces or being able to make really powerful tweaks on the fly was just a really compelling idea to me.
Yeah, I get that, and I'm kind of the same way. As like I want stuff that's easy to deploy. I want things that have all of the bells and whistles. I mean, just looking at this map here, I've got walls that are already set up for me in different configurations. I've got lights that are dynamic and animated, and all using kind of core Foundry stuff. But to set up a map of this size would be very difficult, or I'd have to go find one that's already made, and then I'm going to have to like force my players into whatever story that map is telling. Whereas this map that you guys are seeing was just made by pieces. And when you start thinking about like procedurally generated stuff, those are great. And even those, this type of system can be useful. I mean, this campsite here was just dropped in, right? Here's the campsite itself. And I can drop this onto any even procedurally generated map. And so the utility and power of something like this is, for me, the most interesting part of it, because now I can tell whatever story I want to tell, and I'm not locked in really to anything. But the idea of this being an open source system that multiple people can contribute to, and that, like this chasm you're seeing here is something I built, but this map and these tiles are something that Ben built. So, to be able to combine, two assets together and to do storytelling that way is really, really interesting to me.
I think another thing as well is often when you go online and you're trying to find the right battle map for an event you've got coming up, you generally have to find one that's close enough, and you have to make some exceptions maybe to your story, or you have to excuse away certain details. I know I've done that in the past where my players have been going through a map that they found online, and I have to say, sorry, this isn't one of my maps. That detail's actually not there. With this, you get to combine all the elements and all the shapes, and if it isn't quite right, you just drag off a section that you don't need, drag on a new section, a different shape of room, and it fits your requirements for whatever homebrew or adventure you're doing. And the other thing is with these overlays that we have, the ability to drag on campsites or carts or crates, sometimes maps will change in between gaming sessions. For example, I had my players destroy a statue in one game, and in the next game I had to go back into Dungeon Draft, but I edited the map, deleted the dungeon, put on some broken fragments. This, you wouldn't need to do that. A statue could be an overlay, and you could have other broken statue pieces, and you'd literally drag off the piece that you'd finished using with, and next time your players logged in, your map would reflect the adventures or the things that had happened during the last time they played.
Okay, so I think we're all is because I think we're all DMs, and we're all always in the position of having to storytell and do it on the fly with very little warning or prediction. So, that was one of the goals, is to create something flexible enough to be able to do that. And you can see here's just an example of all of these tile pieces that are available just in one set. And you've got walls built in, and they're all designed to snap together within Foundry so that you can really just drop things in, grab your control token, move them around. You can delete a wall here and there, but really just set up to make this easy for storytelling and to bring some of this advanced stuff in it, like just to kind of show you, some of the pieces that I've got. I've got all these different thrones, right, that have these different light sources and other stuff just kind of set. And but I've got other things like this crypt, being able to customize the actual crypts and what's inside of them. This kind of stuff takes a long time to set up. Like just creating this pile of bones. This was probably an hour of work that now I can just drag out of my compendium and start storytelling the way that I want to. So, that's what gets me really excited about this stuff. So let's talk about I want to talk about a few things. First, I want to talk about the system itself. Like what makes this a system that, if we're calling it open source, what does that mean to people who may want to participate or contribute to something like this? And I think to tell the story, I'm going to actually bring up Ben, your document here. So let me switch my screen share. All right. So what is core, and what am I looking at? What is all this stuff?
Core is a set of rules and guidelines that we as a team fabricated at the very start of this project that allow us to create tiles of different motifs or styles, but they all follow a same pattern. So that when the end user, other DMs, download the Baileywiki packs of tiles and they choose a particular theme, for example, dwarven tunnels or jungle tiles or anything like that, they know that within each of those sets, they're going to be getting the same tiles that perform the same functions. And so as a group, we sat down together and we decided what would be needed to ensure that DMs would have the correct set or the right amount of tiles for them to fabricate any instance. But at the same time, we didn't want to go too far. We didn't want to include every possible variation. So the core document that we have fabricated basically has broken things down into things like naming structures, identifying tags so you can search quickly for different items or assets, basic rules for which third-party content creators like Forgotten Adventures or other things, other creators. What can you use to create your own things? And if you wanted to contribute your own motif or dungeon style to this, you would follow those basic guidelines. It's a few pages long, but it's not insurmountable. Most of it is actually just images and showing styles of dungeon tiles that we would want you to include to ensure that anyone who uses your tiles would go, oh yeah, I really need a tile to do this. and we would ensure that by following core that will be included.
So if somebody wanted to contribute to the system, I'm hearing that they can build a tile motif, like what I just showed, where I have like a brick and stone motif that you may develop a lava or volcano motif, or you can develop things like overlays and assets and decor that can go into other people's motifs, right? And by
Correct.
standardizing on dimensions of rooms and things like that, it creates the ability to, make an overlay, for example, that could go in any number of motifs. And when you guys kind of saw my examples of those overlays, that's how they're kind of designed to be, is, be able to drop in anywhere.
Yeah, the overlays are like the most compelling part to me at this point, because that's where, in my mind, a lot of the storytelling happens. Is by Baileywiki, you put in all these different thrones with these different motifs, and the choice of using like a throne of bones or this stone hand kind of thing, that tells a lot about the space that someone's in. And so adding in all of this extra decor is what really brings things to life. The tiles are amazing for getting this layout and everything, but it doesn't really start to feel like a lived in real space until you start adding in all of this clutter. And that's what the overlays really bring to the table there. And yeah, absolutely. By standardizing the dimensions for things and keeping those there, it allows, say, another creator to go in and make a bunch of different overlays. And then you can drop that into any dungeon, whether it's their tile set or not. And it becomes this really flexible system that way, just beyond even having the floor plan being on the fly. And that also enables some improvisation, kind of going back to what Ben was saying with being able to update a statue, swap out the intact version for the broken version that the players broke. It also allows you to kind of change in, if there's someone else in the dungeon antagonizing the party somewhere, you can stumble across something that they did in a room that may have already been explored, etc. So there's a lot of value to standardizing it in that regard as well for story plan.
I have to say, I love this table. And I put it into other maps when I made the demos for these, just because this is like universally useful for dungeons, right? You've got to have like the room with the table, or you've got to have the room covered in blood.
We got the bloody mess, we got the sinister conference room.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk about how somebody makes this stuff. Like, what's the factory look like? And I have an example of my factory, just to kind of give people an idea of what's involved here. But this is my Dungeon Draft instance, where you can see I'm using sort of common dimensions, and here's the campsite that you saw. And I create it in Dungeon Draft, right? These are just objects and lights and textures. This green background I use because it's a good background to remove later. So in post-processing, when I bring it, I use Clip Studio. Other people use Photoshop or GIMP. But I can create an asset within these certain parameters and then put it into Foundry and create the walls and the lights, and I add the flickering fire and things like that later. But this becomes an asset I make once and I can use 100 times. And there's always a need for like some little, makeshift camp within a dungeon, right? That room that's got spores and fungus, right? When this got in, it finally makes its way into Foundry, it's got, dynamic lights and it kind of glows and pulses. But here's just other throwaway camps, right? That you would use. And, this one is meant to go into the corner of a room, right? So if I want to have some orcs or somebody else, some guards camped in the corner of a room, I can deploy this. But this is unlimited, right? And I can resize these things bigger or smaller within Foundry. And so when you talk about, contributing assets, like just these holes, that maybe worms came through or something else, these are just universally useful for storytelling. And that's, I think, the power of this. But, this is Dungeon Draft. Other people may make similar things inside of, other tools, but as a group, I think we tend to use Dungeon Draft for things. But I wanted to just give people an idea of this. But what else is involved when you're making tiles? What do we need to be considering as we're, as I'm kind of flying through stuff? As people are saying, I'd love to make a necromancer's dungeon motif. What sorts of things are involved with getting there?
Real quick, just to touch on Dungeon Draft and why a lot of our tile sets are very much accomplishable within Dungeon Draft, even though some of us have done a little bit more post-processing, as it were, is, at least in my opinion, Dungeon Draft is the most accessible way to mass produce tiles or maps. And so these come together significantly faster than in some other programs. And so that's kind of why, at least I was really gravitated towards trying to make sure everything was possible within Dungeon Draft. And in terms of actually making the tiles within Dungeon Draft, I think there's a few like core principles that we try to keep in mind for the choice of what tiles to include and how to do them. I think that mostly comes down to trying to make sure that the tiles themselves would allow for the most flexible layouts possible. You'll notice a theme with most of the angled pieces or things that change the direction of a path, that they tend to have the smallest amount of lead-in possible so that you can create the most unique layouts possible with as few pieces as possible. And then after that, it's trying to make things look as seamless as possible so that a player walking through can't tell that these are separate tiles and all that. It looks like it's one piece. And I think those are kind of the main guiding principles there. And then standardizing widths so that you can interact with other pieces and keep it universal. So
Ben, anything to add to like some of the considerations, like anything that was learned along the way with, building these tile sets? Because, we went down some rabbit holes and abandoned certain directions and kind of decided what to, include in core and what not. But,
Yeah. So the process of creating the original core document, and we are on version 0.4 at the moment, we learned several things. We learned about the shortening of the tiles, making sure that the lead-in, as Zephyr said, is as tight as possible, allowing the end user the most amount of flexibility when creating their dungeons. Some of the tighter corners we had to rule out because even though they make sense, you can't actually get a miniature around the corner depending on the placement on the grid. So for somebody designing a new motif, obviously thinking about tokens and token movement and foundry walls, where they would get placed and how would your token get round, that was a large consideration. The next consideration is, for us, is what motifs are we creating and what does the end user want? What are the most useful? I've come up with, I think, 4 or 5 different styles. And one of the things you said, Baileywiki, was what we need to focus on is the tiles that the majority of people are going to use the majority of the time, which is really good. So I've got a couple of ideas which I've put on the shelf, and I've moved over to caves because, of course, Goblin Caves, Lost Mines of Fandelver, and all of that kind of stuff. They are a lot more useful than some of my slightly more zany ideas, which I will get to. But for us, focusing on what we are hoping the end user is going to find useful out the gate. Obviously, it takes us time to produce these tiles, and we want to give the end user the most amount of flexibility off the bat to start creating. And then once we've covered the broad stroke basics, we can start getting into some more exotic tiles. And I think you have a plan of future releases which cover different aspects, whether they be like elemental tiles or planar tiles or stuff like that, which I'm sure you'll be talking about in a few months or in a future release. Other things to consider is how do you want your tiles to join together? Obviously, some tiles, like the ones we're looking at now, they complement each other very well. The individual tile structure is flat-edged and continuous. When you butt 2 tiles up, the seams disappear. Other tiles, like the jungle ones that I made in Bitterbytes, they're all overlapping vines. And so if you have a straight cut between 2 tiles, you'll see that cut quite clearly. And so I have come up with a feathering technique in Photoshop after I've produced the tiles to gently blend out these overlapping tongues, which kind of help hide the seams. But that's not always practical, and it's certainly not an easy or quick thing to do. It does slow down my creative process in doing it. But
here's some examples of your feathering, just so people can see it, because this is an option, right? With the system, you can feather or you cannot. It depends on the tile set that you're creating and how conducive it is to doing this style. But you can see they match up really nicely when they're feathered like that. The alternative is you have 2 hard edges that have to match up on their own.
I think you'll find inside the folder there's the experiment test piece. I'm doing my set names alphabetically, so I know which order I choose them. Yeah, that would right at the bottom where your mouse is. So if you drag that on. So that was a test piece that I made to see whether I could get away without overlapping, without having these tongues or feathering.
Mm-hmm. And so if I match these up, it's not too bad. Most users would never notice that, right?
I know I'm a little bit
Too anal for
picky.
that.
Yeah.
Right. Which is good. But yeah, so you're experimenting with how to butt up to, because these are
Yes.
not, and you can see when I created my tiles, I specifically opted for a very nondescript sort of stone because it does lend itself easier to, to putting two tiles next to each other without necessarily noticing the seam. But that's the decision, and that's the design work that goes into this, right? What you want to make can be a lot of work, especially in post-processing and in Photoshop, but you make it once and it's done, and that tile set now exists forever. What are some things that people should be keeping in mind of when they're building a dungeon? Like, what are some tips for, like, okay, I've got all these tile sets now. Now I want to go about actually building, one of these dungeons.
For me, when we were putting together our test dungeons, I did it a couple of times in different ways, and I found it actually a lot easier to put my rooms in first and then to build my corridors out. So the rooms are obviously the focus of the dungeon. It's where all the events happen, all the encounters. It's unlikely you're going to have a big battle in a 10-foot by 15-foot corridor. So by placing your rooms and making sure you've got those where you need them to be, you can then select your hall pieces or corridor pieces to connect those together. And then once you've done that, if there's any spaces, you think, oh, I could squeeze another room in there. But I would start off with the main chamber where the main, perhaps, boss encounter is going to be, and also the entrance, and any other major events that happen or you want your players to encounter on the way through.
I think some other things that I found helpful as I was building is, your token attacher is what makes all of these work, and that'll be explained in another video. But you drag a control token in, and then you move your tile, and the walls all move around with it. But then ultimately, you want to make some adjustments after it's placed. So I like this macro that comes with token attacher, where you turn on quick edit mode, and now you can take a tile that's sitting on top of another one in the wrong way, and you can, change it so it's underneath, for example, or, grab a control token that might be, and while, yes, it's invisible, dragging it outside of the wall so that it's just not in the way. Things like that. And you'll notice then all my control tokens are outside of the field of play here. And that gives me a nice sort of starting point for actually, running players through a dungeon that I just built. What's the future of this system? What do we hope, and what can the community at large sort of expect next from this effort?
I think the future is overlays. I think you should probably talk about overlays more than anything, because that's I think what we discussed is for third-party creators and everything, creating these overlays that you and Bailey can produce so much better than I can. I honestly think this is where the future is. I think everything we're doing now, these tiles and these dungeon motifs, they're nice, but I think people are going to have a couple of favorites, or they're going to just choose a style because they're in a jungle. They're going to choose a jungle, or they're in a dwarven crypt. They're going to choose a dwarven crypt. I think those are very basic choices, but I think the future really is what you and Bailey do in creating these overlays, giving the players so much flexibility, because a room is just a room and a hallway is just a hallway. But when you drag in your throne of bone and your pile of bone, you've suddenly changed the theme and the feel of that chamber. And I think you should talk about that. I think that's where it really is.
Yeah, I showed you guys a bit of the factory, but this is what I want to see anyone want to design, is these motifs that really create the story. The walls and things, just like you said, Ben, are they're the canvas, but it's what goes into them that makes it interesting. And with a platform like Foundry, where you can, I'll just show you what's inside of some of these interesting elements. You can create two images, WebP files, and apply a filter to one of them, and all of a sudden you've got this sort of really interesting, you know, effect, and you can drag it in anytime. You can have sound effects tied to it. It's a powerful platform, and it's where DMs that don't have artistic ability can leverage the ability of others to really impress their players. And let's face it, as DMs, we're really just in this game to impress our players. That's what we live for, is when they
We're
are
never impressed.
and they're never impressed enough for the effort that goes into it. But when they're moving through a dungeon and they come into, if I just drag a player over here, and they don't know what's at the other end of this hallway, but they open this door and, all of a sudden they're surrounded by enemies and they've got this, crazy bone throne here. I mean, that's a lot of fun. It's those moments that we're building towards. And so what I'd like to see is artists come together and build more of these overlays. We happen to use Forgotten Adventures. It's a great world building asset source. There's others that will complement it. But yeah, I think you're right, Ben, is that, where I see this going is people contributing to it. And I see people monetizing those contributions. I see people building whole Patreons to establish overlays and kits and sets that will help with the storytelling process. And that's really what I'd like to see come out of this. Zephyr, what do you think?
Yeah, I definitely agree that like the overlays are the substance that goes on the canvas. I think what else is coming down the pipe, this is a little bit more from our side of adding in more tile sets to be like versatile, but absolutely agree that the overlays are where this really goes crazy, and the sky is the limit, right? Because now we have this really great canvas that everyone can use to have the floor plan for their dungeons, but then everyone is going to want a slightly different tweak on their dungeon. So this proliferation of overlays and decor is what's really going to just crack making dungeons in Foundry like wide open, is being able to make these changes on the fly, being able to have a really custom motif by mixing and matching these different overlays from different creators. And every creator can make something really interesting and cool that can fit in a variety of settings. For example, the table we're looking at right now, as you mentioned, you dropped it into a few of the other example dungeons, and it looks right at home. Even though I originally made it to match this set a little bit more, it works great in a lot of other places. And I think that's where it gets really interesting, is all of these overlays being able to be mixed and matched into different dungeons to create a unique feel for each dungeon.
That looks pretty good. Yeah, I just love that you put that light in there. Those little things just take forever to do, and to have it be an asset you can just drop on the scene is just magic.
It is amazingly liberating to never have to think about that again.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And by the way, once it's in, maybe I want this to be, if I turn on my quick edit, maybe I want this to be a green light. Well, Foundry is such a powerful system that, that becomes instantly possible. Right? I've got a green light. That's great. And I can even save this. Maybe I'd like it to be always a green light. I can save it as a prefab as a DM, and now I've got this table to use wherever. Ben, you've got something you're working on, another tile set. Speaking of other tile sets.
Yeah, so this is kind of what we mentioned earlier. We're forward-looking. We're trying to cover the broad base, what people are going to use the majority of the time. And as I mentioned, goblin caves and that kind of thing. I have been working on trying to produce caves that interlock and join together. And obviously, the flowing natural nature of caves makes it a very difficult to get these tiles to line up. Okay. So as I mentioned before, we're trying to cover the broad basics of what we think the majority of people are going to use for the majority of the time. And one of the big things, obviously, is exploring caves, going down to the depths and finding either goblins or drow, depending on wherever you are. So this is the start of my basic cave project. And what I've done is I haven't gone with the feathering, even though the floor is irregular. I've created the tiles so they should join together almost seamlessly. And because I've used Forgotten Adventures and I've used their modular cave walls, all the connections between the different tiles should join up perfectly. And because I'm very particular, you can see that you can't really tell where one tile ends and the second one begins. It's not just a case of throwing a floor down and then joining another floor to it. I've actually spent a lot of time creating a feathered edge, which I've cut in half, mirrored, reattached, and then feathered and blended.
Fantastic.
So, and then I've had to paste those into each of my tiles so that you can see down here, there's no symmetrical patterns, but it doesn't matter which way I rotate my tile, you still get that effect.
That
so
is
this is
brilliant.
A project that it's taken a long time. So this is what I've been working on, and we will hopefully have out with Baileywik's April release. I'm guessing April is the next one for you, isn't it, Bailey? After obviously this first one.
Yeah, probably.
Oh, that one doesn't work. Look at that. Does it work? Oh, it does work. Just there you go. Anyway, yeah. So Goblin Caves or Underdark Caves. There'll be a lot more tiles that will go together with this set once we've explored the potential. I think rooms is going to be the bigger one for this. Lots of chambers. But yeah, that's the latest I'm working on.
I want to point something out. I'm going to take your screen share away and start sharing mine again. Just the flexibility of this, I don't know that people really realize, but let's say, for example, I like this tile set, but I really want it to be more of, I don't know, like a red, maybe this is inside of a volcano or something. And even with my motifs, I've got a lot of flexibility in terms of my palette. And all of a sudden I've got, more of a red one, or, maybe I want to turn it green or blue because it's more of in an icy type of environment. So it really, between Dungeon Draft and Foundry and this system, those three things intersecting. And I'll also point out Forgotten Adventures. Forgotten Adventures, you can drag their assets. If you want a ballista, you can drag it right onto a map. And, so those kind of four elements coming together have, for me, given me unlimited creativity in terms of my dungeon making abilities. So anyway, for what it's worth, I love it. How does somebody get involved with this?
That is a good question, because one of the things I was going to say is, are we going to talk about releasing the core document? What are we doing with that?
A restricted version that is readable to everyone else, but only we can edit it.
Okay, that'd be good.
I
Then we can
think
continue
that
to
would be the
update.
better choice, because then you could update it as needed, and you would be sure that everyone has access to the latest version.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, that's right. And my Discord is currently the place to get into the conversation and discuss this. I'll put links to all of this stuff to help people kind of find their way, or at least inquire to this group how they might get involved, and if they want to be a contributor to the system in any way. And that's still yet to be discovered, right? This is the core. This was the proof of concept, just to show what this type of system can create. Now the question is how do you refine it and build on top of it from here? So that's the open invitation to anyone that sees this that might be interested in collaborating. Come find us on my Discord, at least to start with, and then we'll carry it forward from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for context for everyone, we've kind of marveled at this a few times ourselves, but all of this came together starting with a brief conversation in the Discord at the beginning of the month. This has come together in a little under 4 weeks. We hadn't even started a tile yet, and this is what we've got. So there's a lot of room for innovation, considering we've only had about 4 weeks of actually working on this. So there's definitely a lot of room for new faces at the table and new ideas.
Yeah, and it's very accelerated. Like to your point, it's been very accelerated, because when multiple people are working on a problem, I have my blind spots, and there's been a number of times where I was like, oh, it should be done this way. And then you guys will have an infinitely better suggestion that course corrects me, that would have, I would have had weeks of undoing, had I not been part of the collaborative conversation. So I've really enjoyed it. And I think that the end result, I mean, this is just great. This is awesome. the end result has been worth the effort. So that's it, I think, for today. Appreciate you guys jumping on and walking us through the system and how it came to be. But yeah, with that, I think we'll let everybody go. And yeah, looking forward to the next few releases. This is really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been fun, and I'm excited to see where this goes from here.
Awesome.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks, guys. Appreciate all the work, and we'll see you on Discord.
All right.
Sounds good.
You're
Chat to
out.
you later.
All right. Cheers.